Hello, welcome to the Frontline Club, and for tonight's event, which is in association with BBC World Service. So thank you to Roxana Shapur and everybody at BBC World Service. Before I hand you over to Robin Pembroke, who will be chairing tonight's discussion, and he is Head of Product at BBC News Online. If I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we're broadcasting this evening's event on our website. So over to Robin.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you for coming. Really delighted to be here with Rafal Rohozinski. Yes, pronounced it right. Got it right. My name's Robin Pembroke, so I'm Head of Product for BBC News Online. What that means is I look after the product managers, designers, developers who build all of the BBC website apps, things like that. So the thing I have to get out on the table right now is I'm not a journalist. So for being in a room of journalists and I'm about to try and conduct a conversation and interview, don't hold me accountable for my bad interviewing skills. Rafal, how many people have been at the workshops that Rafal's been running in London in the last couple of days? Not many, that's good.
Not many, there
you
go.
can repeat.
One.
You can repeat virtually everything you've been saying. Rafal, founder and CEO of SecDev.
Correct, yeah.
One of the underlying kind of drivers behind Psiphon as well, and previously worked at the United Nations. An absolute expert, global expert in the field in terms of that intersection between social media, data, other data sources in the news gathering process. And we're talking about how that's going to be playing a key role in the redefining of news of the future. Rafal, do you want to briefly introduce yourself? You can do a better job than I can at the moment.
Sure.
A bit about your background before we get going.
Well, maybe the better way to tell the background of the story is to say how I got interested in this whole area, how cyberspace is essentially changing not just journalism, but really the sort of social contract between individuals and states. In the early 1990s, I went to Ukraine just at the time that the former Soviet Union was falling apart. At that time, I was part of a monitoring mission under something called the Nunn-Lugar Act that most of us forget about, but which was really an effort that was done between Russia and the United States to try to uncover the totality of the stocks of nuclear weapons as well as the nuclear weapons material that existed in the former Soviet Union. So I landed in Ukraine to basically try to enumerate all of this. And one of the challenges that we had is that collecting fissile material is relatively easy. It's physical. It's easy. Collecting together the expertise is a lot more difficult because the knowledge resides in people's brains. And the question, of course, was, what do we do with these people that have specific knowledge around nuclear weapons that we want to reintegrate into the civilian population? So the one thing that I realized about physicists that I didn't know before is that all of them depend on doing collaborative experiments. And that means sharing time on large computers in order to run routines. Lo and behold, when we realized that, we thought, well, gee, how do we take this vast number of physicists that we can't physically move to Ukraine, out of Ukraine and into laboratories in places like CERN, but connect them to these supercomputers? Well, the answer was the internet. And if all of you remember what the internet looked like in 1990, it was a blinking green cursor on a cathode ray tube. So we essentially started building an internet-connected physicist. But much to my surprise, we weren't the first to do that. Because unbeknownst to us, unbeknownst to the US and the Western intelligence community, there was an internet that was already built in the former Soviet Union. But that internet wasn't built by an official state program with state funding with some intent in mind. No, it was built by the physicists themselves who stole computer time and stole telephone lines between centers in order to set up their own exchange system for knowledge. And mind you, they weren't the only ones. In fact, the very first ISP in Kiev was built by a 28-year-old mafioso by the name of Semen Yufa, who realized he could use this system in order to exchange the accounts between his brothels and casinos around the country. Now, what that taught me was one very important lesson. And that is that as much as we think that we shape technology by the choices that we make, it's very often the other way around. Technology follows the kinds of instrumental uses that only our creativity allows it to make. And that very much became a motif for the next 20 years as I grew up contemporaneously with the way that networks grew from something which was quite elite, quite technical, quite, if you like, isolated in few Western countries to something that has become quite global. And that's really the revolution that we're looking at now. Currently, more than 2/3 of the world is online. And interestingly enough, that 2/3 of the world doesn't reside in Europe and North America. Increasingly, it resides in countries where the motivations of individuals, the creativity, is being unleashed through a technology that gives them pretty well global access.
So one of the things that I think we met for the first time earlier today and had a brief discussion about what we were going to talk about this evening. And I think a really interesting thing about our two relative backgrounds is Rafal's clearly got this very extensive background in how networks and data are used in identifying information and identifying trends and in the news gathering process at the beginning of the process, spotting what's happening. My background is very much around how broadcast organisations and news organisations publish that information out to consumers on digital platforms. So it's one of the things that I think is interesting for us to explore here is around the links between both news gathering processes and how those are changing around structured data and how that's also changing around consumer-facing products as well. So some of the stuff that we're looking at the moment with the BBC is around how we use linked data and structured data patterns to be able to tell stories to users in different ways. And that's some of the patterns that we're going to be able to explore over the next kind of 40, 45 minutes before opening it out to yourselves to engage in that conversation. So tell us briefly about SecDev now, and just so people have got that overview of what your organisation does and what it is. Just give us that overview.
Well, I mean, the overview really is this. We caught on fairly early on that in a world where information becomes plentiful as opposed to scarce, the ones who are going to benefit are those who could find the information quickest, validate it, and be able to put it to useful purposes. And that isn't easy, because in a way, you know, the challenge was 10, 15 years ago, in news gathering, for example, it's you had to be the person on the ground in the place in order to be able to cover the story. Now the story unfolds because of what? Hundreds of people in an area with cell phones, snapping pictures, picking up a story first. But in many ways, that poses a big challenge. Let's take, for example, the Boston bombings that occurred almost a year ago. One of the most tweeted about events ever. More than 7 million tweets of people in a city that was densely covered with information technology. Challenge was that about 60% of the tweets, when analyzed ex post facto, were actually false, made up information. People saying things that didn't make sense. That's a huge challenge for news agencies.
Malicious or not?
No, just not malicious. It's just human nature. I mean, people will say things. This is not meant to be a medium of truth. This is meant to be a medium of rumor, of immediate communication. But the challenge that poses for organizations like news organizations is pretty significant. Because on one hand, there's the temptress's hand that says, I can get something that's happening in real time in a way that I couldn't unless I was there. Much more so in a place like Kigali than even Boston, where it says. But on the other hand, how do I know? How can I validate that what I'm getting, you know, has confidence value to me that I can actually report on it? And that's what we specialize in SecDev, is in effect the methodologies for making that at scale in a way that could service an organization as a continuous need for it.
But is it just that you've got a set of products that allow that have got very sophisticated algorithms in them to kind of filter out the noise, or is it more actually a kind of methodology of how people interpret large flows of information that are coming from Twitter?
It's very, very much a methodology, and in fact, I'd be quite unabashed about it by saying that we've plagiarized the best of what the last 12 years of intelligence practice have brought to the fore. Okay. And I think that's one thing to understand, especially in a room full of people who probably have been war correspondents at some point in their life, that all wars create a forcing function. In the First World War, it was the creation of mobile artillery, which came to be known as tanks. By the end of the Second World War, we had the air-land battle and nuclear weapons. The single greatest forcing function in the last 12 years of conflict against Al-Qaeda, if we want to call it that, has been the way that intelligence and information has been put to use in the application of force. And we see that in many different ways. The Snowden disclosures, for example, have revealed the apparatus that has been built around that. But behind that apparatus is not so much technology, but methodology. That has evolved in leaps and bounds. And that methodology includes being know where to look, acuity, as well as fidelity, who to listen to, how to validate sources, how to do things which have arcane names from intelligence practice, such as entity resolution, but which translate almost one-to-one in the journalism world as know your source, be able to report the facts. And that's essentially what we focused on, because technology is fickle. It'll change. In fact, one of the things about cyberspace, which is ultimately different about any other human domain, is that it's synthetic. It's a man-made domain. It exists only because of the fact that humans affect the code and the policy to make it work, which means it can change at any time. And focusing on a platform or focusing on a technology, you do at your peril. Imagine yourself at BBC if you had made the decision 3 years ago that MySpace was going to be the platform that you were going to get news gathering with. Where would you be today?
Well, it's not a big single decision you make. I mean, one of the things I observe in our newsroom is that actually as you go around the different desks and the different news gathering areas, is that virtually every journalist you talk to has got a different kind of personal solution, right? It's a different combination of just using Twitter or TweetDeck, or there's one of the things that's interesting about this is it's almost overwhelming in terms of the number of different companies that are coming into this space with solutions that they claim is the answer. In terms of whether they've got very sophisticated algorithms that say, okay, we know in this geolocation that there are X number of people that have suddenly tweeted the word bomb or explosion, and therefore that surfaces up an alert. I think one of the words they say is smoke, but of course they're saying, well, actually, problem is quite a lot of people tweet the word smoke, but it's quite often, I'm going out for a smoke. It's like, it doesn't indicate that there's a fire. So is it... I guess one of the things I'm not quite clear on in terms of what you're saying is it the strength of the algorithms? Is it something that is, have you got products that, or do you think that you've observed products that really kind of give that competitive edge? I'm not clear on
well, algorithms certainly play a role in it, but I'd say the misnomer is that the expert in expert system isn't the algorithm, it's the human being in the loop. Right. It's the person who can apply his judgment for it. In fact, one of the things that we, again, I think plagiarized from some of the best in the intelligence community is a cross-disciplinary approach. Yeah. So the teams that we work are generally made up of three kinds of individuals.
Yes.
We have a subject matter expert, who's someone who effectively has the tacit knowledge to be able to look at something and say, it's this rather than that.
Of a geography,
of a language, of an area, of a person. So this is the person that has enough domain experience, as they say, that to be able to use that as a filter. We have someone who is a technologist or data analyst, in other words, someone who can effectively interpret what a subject matter expert wants and scale either the collection of data that they're looking at or algorithmically to be able to define things that an individual analyst can't find or an individual subject matter can't find. And then we have a third person, and that's our analyst. That's the person who's trained in formal methods, who I like to say keeps the other two honest. But basically, that's the person that can say there's a bias selection here. The methodology is wrong. That basically corrects it. And it's that team, frankly, much more so than the algorithms, that makes the difference. I mean, algorithms are very much like something that can, if you're looking at your recyclable waste, can say this is organic, this is glass, this is thing. But the possibility of false positives in that is fairly high unless you apply the tacit knowledge to be able to interpret it. Don't forget, we're talking about a technical domain, but we're talking about human action.
Yes.
Would you have a robot write a news story for you? Probably not.
No.
You wouldn't have them do the analysis on what you get from cyberspace either.
So you gave us the example of Boston earlier, in terms of, that's clearly it's a big case study. It's used in lots of different places. Have you got some other examples of either specific events or specific organisations that you think are kind of doing this right, and are really good examples that you can talk about of where it's really made a difference to a breaking news story?
Well, I think there's been quite a few. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, I think that we're kind of in a Wild West situation right now. There's a lot of experimentation being done by a lot of different people. Interestingly enough, there are people from the technology community that are trying to guess what it is that, for example, the journalism community wants to do. At the same time, there are people that are coming out of the journalism community, embracing technology and seeing how we can actually cross over the other way. And I think there's some fairly good examples of both. There's a company called Data Miner out of the US, which has recently signed an agreement with Twitter, basically to be able to take what they call the fire hose of Twitter traffic and analyze it for patterns that can be indicative of news stories either breaking or not breaking. In fact, Data Miner was one of the companies that initially was able to catch the fact that something was happening during the Boston bombings and report it in a systematic way. Interestingly enough, they weren't able to wean out the 60% of tweets that were ultimately incorrect. They simply showed volume. On the other end of the spectrum, we have companies like Storyful, out of Ireland, which effectively has guessed on the fact that by using the same kind of proven techniques that journalists have always used of source validation, i.e. find out where something is happening, find out the individuals who are taking it, and ultimately contact them right away, has taken a different model of being able to, in effect, identify stories and use social media or use user-generated content as a way of being able to get it. Problem with their approach is scalability, that it's still very much dependent on the human in the loop to make that phone call. What happens is there's 20 things going on at the same time. Or for an organization like yourselves, where essentially you're looking at the world, how well could you scale the kinds of resources that Storyful has had? So our approach has been really to try to hit the middle ground. We recognize the absolute role of the individual and the skill set the journalist has, which is a journalist skill set that has been there through print, radio, television, into the internet era, which is what? Investigation. It's the instinct for the story, looking for the angle, searching through that. But what we've sought to be able to automate is the process of scanning so as to be aware of something going on, triaging as a way of being able to understand who the key actors are, and validating the sources that ultimately the journalist who becomes the human that follows the story will contact as the entry point for the story that they write.
Okay. So you mentioned data miner. Is it JV with Twitter or not? I can't remember whether it's in terms of the relationship.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that they've just announced a partnership. That's right. Yeah. I mean, they've been chosen as the partner there. Facebook and the Murdochs have basically taken Storyful as their champion.
But you mentioned Twitter, and I think it's interesting that a lot of the tools I see, and a lot of the tools I see in newsrooms, people be interested to get other people's views. A lot of them are very Twitter dependent.
Yep.
And I wonder how much of an issue you think that is, because is the penetration consistent of Twitter or coverage of Twitter consistent across the world? Does it bias us to certain types of people? Is there a danger of over-dependence on it as a platform?
I think so. I mean, Twitter is very easy to understand because, first of all, it's a medium of immediate communication outwards. So as a result, it's become literally the equivalent of the news flash, if you like. But 300 million, that's how many people are on Twitter.
It's fair coverage.
And it's, well, a fair coverage, but it's proportionally pretty small. Secondly, it tends to be quite specific to specific regions. If you're doing something domestically, meaning Europe, North America, it's probably pretty good. Twitter in Uzbekistan, I wouldn't say is the most reliable source. And in fact, I think that's the danger of platform dependence. I mean, one of the things that was a process anyway, but which has been accelerated by the Snowden disclosures, has been a reconsideration of the governance of cyberspace overall, and the increasing propensity to start creating digital borders. Right. Essentially creating fences around regions, whether those fences are described in terms of linguistic patterns or those fences are economic fences or ultimately political fences like the Great Firewall of China or the halal internet in Iran. These patterns effectively mean that increasingly the internet is becoming rendered in the vernacular. And being rendered in the vernacular means that it's also being served up on social media platforms that are quite specific to either regions, countries, or areas. For example, if you were living in Kazakhstan, you have a choice. Choice is you can use the social media platform that happens to be linked to Kazakh Telecom, which you get at a flat rate, and you can share with your friends, and it's all in Russian and Kazakh.
Does it have a catchy name? What's the brand of it?
Number.
Number. Okay, right. Yeah.
Or you could choose to use Facebook. But the problem there is that if you're accessing it from your cell phone, you're going to be paying a premium price because you're retrieving traffic from abroad. So as a result, I mean, if you look at it from that point of view, Vkontakte, which is the most dominant Facebook-like platform in Russia, far outnumbers the number of users that exist on Facebook. So a dependence on things like Twitter or on Facebook because they're accessible, because they're English, because they're here, it's a wrong bet.
I was going to say, because I've not seen many of these tools that do cut across those.
They don't. And the internet of the future, especially if you're oriented abroad in terms of news coverage, is going to become specialized to the Vkontaktes, the Numbers, and the plethora of social media platforms that are now coming into being, but they're very specific to populations, linguistic groups, or geographies.
China?
Weibo.
Okay.
Weibo. So, you know, there are, absolutely. I mean, you know, Google may rule the world, but it certainly doesn't rule China.
And how easy or not easy is it to kind of tap into the, you know, we've got the Twitter fire hose. I'm assuming there's not a particularly open kind of, you know.
Well, I think you put your finger on it. And, you know, from a point of view, if the tables were turned and I was sitting in a BBC point of view, that's, I think, the temptress's hand in terms of the technology companies that are knocking on your doors. Yeah. Many of them are oriented towards the easy problem, yes, which is how do you cover the population that's already here within the borders, that uses Twitter, that uses Facebook. They're not thinking about how do we build a collection system or methodology that allows you to cover Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. And yet it's in those countries, actually, that the ability to be able to get a scanning of the news horizon, yeah, a validation of the sources, an understanding of the local kind of discussions that are ultimately the source of news that are the most important.
But do you think there are products that do aggregate across all of those big geographical lead players, or is it that you just need someone who's got the expertise to know where to look and to know which of those platforms?
Well, I think there's an argument here which will only be played out over time. I mean, if I was to be completely unethical, I'd say, hey, hire us, we do that, because that's kind of what we specialize in. But if I was sitting in your position, it's kind of a decision that institutions like BBC need to make. I think there's certainly a valid point to be made that there are some functions, technical functions, that can be outsourced, just in the same way as when broadcast journalism first came into being. You didn't service your own cameras very often. These things were provided by the firms. Same thing in the cyber area. But ultimately, I think, if you look at the report, the recently leaked report about the New York Times, some of the recommendations they made, one of them was actually caught my eye because it had a good ring, is that we need makers inside of New York Times. What does makers mean? That means people who are technology creators, but who sit within the news organization, that understand organically your problem. And when you do need to have coverage of a place like Venezuela, they can build it for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way, I guess, the BBC has traditionally covered that is by having our bureaus that are distributed around the world with the World Service. Mm-hmm. It's about having that local knowledge. It's about having people who've got local insights into those tools and are able to use it. And then through a kind of our almost like the internal wires service that we run in combination with these kind of tools you're talking around and the more traditional wires service, that's what creates that internal web of knowledge that we're looking to tap into.
And I'd almost argue, that if I was to take out my crystal ball, that at some stage in the game, you're going to have virtual bureaus. I mean, one of the things about cyberspace is that it's globally contiguous. Yeah. But you still do need to, and it gives you access to previously what would be the kitchen conversations that were only locally accessible. In fact, that's one of the things about social media that's so compelling, is that previously, in order to know what a small community was talking about on the coast of the Caspian Sea, you would have to have someone who'd been there, met the people, understood it. Yeah. Because the conversations would be happening around the kitchen table, in the local shop or whatever else. But social media has made those conversations accessible everywhere. The problem is being able to understand it. And that's where the idea of a virtual bureau almost becomes important. It's not accessing the data that's the challenge. It's interpreting the data. It's making sense of it. It's knowing what you're looking for.
So there's some risks with some of this approach as well. So, I mean, what about the risks of the algorithmically driven stuff, which picks up, okay, certain number of tweets about this subject or things that are trending out on the wires on a different platform? What about the risk of people kind of spamming the news in terms of ways in which they can actually be able to kind of generate automated ways to kind of create news that may or may not be happening?
That's a very good point. And in fact, one of the sort of trends we started talking about it, but maybe didn't finish it. There's been sort of two major trends in the way that journalism has adapted to this new environment. The first has been the emergence of something called data journalism, which is simply a recognition that with the accessibility of now data in machine-readable format, the ability to assemble it at scale, there was actually stories that could be written about data rather than people. So that's one form. The other has been this form of journalism called open journalism, which has been championed by the Guardian in the last little while, where the idea is that there is no particular end or beginning to a story, that a story develops concurrently with the way that people develop it outside, that the journalist is almost a participant in a drama that's being written. Now, it makes certain assumptions. One of the assumptions that it makes is that there is truth value that can be derived, a priori from what you get in cyberspace, from listening to conversations, from listening to data points as they come in. Challenge with that is, there's an old adage that the New Yorker put out some years ago, on the internet nobody knows that you're a dog. And in some respects, recognizing that this is a domain that can be ultimately malleable to manipulation, to deliberate disinformation, is something which hasn't quite sunk in yet to the journalism community, very much enamored by the fact that data is so accessible. And I'll give you a couple of examples. We've been covering the Syrian conflict by monitoring Syrian cyberspace for the last year and a half. Fascinating conflict. One of the reasons for it is, prior to the conflict in Syria, out of a population of 20 million, there were 14 million cell phone users. So think about that. If you take away the very old, the very young, and the very poor, pretty well every man, woman, and child in Syria was carrying a cell phone. Since the conflict, we've seen an increase of over 500,000 new users. Think about that.
At
a time when you've got 2 million people above outside the borders and 8 million people internally displaced. Why is that? Well, for any of you who have spent time as a civilian in a war zone, what's the one thing that's most important than anything else? Knowing what's going on around you, right? Access to information. Is it safe for me to go outside? Is my family can go shopping? Is as important as access to water, food, and shelter. So that's meant that Syria has become an environment, a war, first war, I would say, that is in effect being fought in the full glare of cyberspace. In fact, interestingly enough, there have been more hours of video footage uploaded to YouTube from Syria than have there been hours of the Syrian conflict to begin with. So as we sort of parsed through this to try to understand actors, events, and everything else, we recognized a funny pattern about a year and a half ago. It occurred about the same time when Sana, the main news agency, started to lose traction with the international news community. When we looked at it backwards, we saw at the same time a contemporaneous rise in the seemingly large community of pro-Assad supporters, people who were somehow very favorably talking about the regime. When we looked at it closer, we realized, and we looked at some of the people that were within this community. They looked like real people. They had a picture. There was a picture of their house, their kids, the vacation they took. Everything seemed consistent. But when we analyzed it using an algorithmic method, we realized that all of these accounts, these thousands of accounts that seemed genuine, were all pulsing out pretty well the same message. What we discovered is something known as a semantic botnet. Right. It was created in order to amplify, to create the impression of a larger community that was in favor of something, but it was entirely artificial. There were no people behind it.
It was about promoting a kind of propaganda message, or about pretending something that was happening that wasn't.
It was more subtle than propaganda. It was meant to create that there was an active discourse among a community that was generally aligned and favorable with the state. And what's interesting is that this particular botnet that we discovered was not discovered by Twitter, because the signals that it had were weak enough that they weren't hitting the thresholds that companies like Twitter use to discover them. Now think about that. If you were a field reporter who was responsible, who was using social media as a way of reporting on events, you'd be influenced by that. There would be no way that you can see it. And it's not just Syria. When we looked at the street unrest and protest last year, in the midst of the riots that occurred in Rio de Janeiro, doing this analysis, we found another small cluster. At that time, what it was an artfully created, what they call robo-lobby. So in this case, it was a robo-lobby. It was basically a group that commissioned its services for a specific group of economic interests that wanted to lobby 3 very influential Rio politicians. Yeah. Because Rio politicians were being quite affected by the activity in cyberspace, they correctly calculated that by creating the impression of a much larger lobby for a particular issue, that they would be able to influence these politicians at a time when they were very vulnerable to making key decisions. If we looked back at the last 3 elections in Russia, a lot of the online support for Putin's party, you would discover exactly the same kind of thing. And this kind of artfully created disinformation environment.
There's a potential risk of just a compound effect of just more and more noise and more and more different techniques.
And the more we become enamored with cyberspace as a principal source of news, the more organizations such as yours need to become very aware of the fact that that ability to manipulate the environment is also there and very significant.
So another big issue here is okay, you're looking across Twitter, you're looking across all these different kind of platforms, and tapping into other data sources as well. As you were saying earlier, a lot of this has come from the intelligence community, the tech and the understanding and the processes, and it's crossing into news and news gathering. I mean, this raises all manner of issues around, privacy, surveillance. I mean, what's the kind of line that you take on this with your news organization clients?
This is a huge, huge issue, but that scales larger than news organizations, but I think hits news organizations very, very much front and center, because paradoxically, amongst all public institutions, news agencies and intelligence agencies face the same conundrum. Yeah. Both of you are trying to answer a question. both of you are trying and answer a question that ultimately is dependent on people, and that ultimately the revealing of whatever it is that you're after is going to have direct consequences for a number of individuals. In the case of intelligence community, it may be a signature strike or a targeted killing or whatever. In the case of journalism, ultimately it's what? Revealing your source, revealing the subject of your investigation. You know, as you become more dependent on using cyberspace as a way of identifying stories, the same ethical considerations. Do we use metadata as a way of being able to identify what we're looking for? Do we use entity resolution as a way of being able to identify the people? How much do we reveal? How much do we collect? Start to become exactly the same kinds of issues that have been raised by the Snowden inquiry. Now, there may be very legitimate reasons for that. If we take away the cyberspace side and say, is revealing the subject of investigation ultimately not what a journalist's responsibility is? Yeah. Well, it is. But are the steps that you take in reaching there ones that touch on the threshold of privacy, touch on the threshold of collection and holding of information? Absolutely they do. And I think that's part of the larger puzzle of what I said, you know, in this social contract, which we negotiated in physical space painfully over decades and centuries, now being put at risk and forced to be reevaluated by the fact that we've surrendered so much of our personal existence to an environment where these rules are quite gray and undefined.
It's completely up in the air, right?
It's completely up in the air, absolutely.
Because it's almost like you come down to this thing of like how many, if you're looking at sources say, so if it is a certain number of people have tweeted this, therefore it must be true. I mean, is it, in terms of this, any form of kind of guidance or case studies around that, in terms of how many different points of validation do you need if you're just coming straight from something that's being talked about on Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because some of these concepts which have come out of intelligence practice have no equivalent in existing legislation. So, for example, I go back to the concept of entity resolution. How many of you know what entity resolution is? Does anybody? So this is a concept that comes out of intelligence practice. It basically says, I can take 3 or 4 points of unrelated data. Any one of those 3 or 4 points have no inimical value on privacy of an individual, but taken together, they actually give me a very comprehensive picture. It's very challenging because currently the way the privacy legislation is written is by defining that this object is to be considered privately identifiable information. Right. But if all I have is 4 or 5 weak signals, but which together form an object, that has no legal definition.
Okay, fascinating. I want to switch through to the, okay, we've talked a lot about the news gathering and how the structured data is used in identifying what's happening and those kind of trends. And I want to switch a bit in terms of talking around how we can use this information in terms of how we tell stories to consumers of news on digital products. So I think one of the things I want to talk on is around collaboration around that process. So one of the things that we've been working on is a structured data model around how to tag and label news, and we've called it the storyline data model, which we've worked on with PA and Guardian and Google. It's basically an anthology for news that says you can label any piece of news by any organisation, place, person, theme, storyline, and that inside each of those you've got a storyline can consist of a series of events that happen over time. And we're using it, what we've done is kind of we've analysed back 300,000, 400,000 articles that we've published over the last couple of years and begun to try and spot links between published stories. So not in terms of stories that are happening now, but beginning to see how you can map the relationships between stories that have been published in the past, and looking at that across publishers and things like that. And what we're finding interesting is that it's quite easy to get the data architects in these organisations together to kind of talk about a theoretical model and to begin to use the same kind of structured data approach. But it's around finding the incentives for collaboration of being able to produce consumer-facing products. And in terms of thinking around use cases where news organisations can come together to tell a story as it evolves around some of those themes or those storylines and things like that. So what we're struggling with is around incentives for collaboration at the front end. Yeah. And I wonder whether you hit the same kind of thing in news gathering in terms of that incentives for
Well,
collaboration?
I'd have to say that I'm highly sympathetic to the problem, and I can understand why you earn the money that you do by having to address them on an everyday basis. But I'd put it differently. It's not collaboration. What you're looking for is the basis of co-opetition, which is competition and collaboration, where the two come together. So I think the incentive for collaboration is it defends your brand as a news agency as opposed to a startup bunch of bloggers who are simply trying to tell a story. That by being able to create these linkages over time, you in effect create a consistency and a kind of a trustworthiness in the product, which I think is difficult for an individual small startup to be able to do. That defends in effect, the kind of quality control measures that you as elite media or media and as institutions can defend. But in a way, what you're also creating by analogy is what happened in the 1990s in the stock market, where all of a sudden Bloomberg screens became something was universal across all playing houses.
Data became
interoperable.
Yeah.
Everyone had the same playing field. In order to play, you had to use it. You had the same access to data. But what was the differentiator? The differentiator was who could find the trend first and act upon it.
Yeah.
And that's where the competition part comes in. You may all share the same brand. You may defend the same quality bar, the club that is institutional media. But you compete on your ability to find the story and report the story faster than your competitor. And that actually comes back into the domain of where I operate, on the news gathering side. Because a differentiator is not necessarily the basis upon which you build the fundament, but it's the ability to make, to use the trader's terms, the trade faster, spot the trend quicker than your competitor.
Yeah. So in terms of, it's an interesting analogy, because actually if you look in terms of structurally in that industry, in terms of what happened, was that as a result of that technological shift, was there a major change in the structure of that industry in terms of the nature of the organizations and whether it was the established or new entrants that kind of won? I mean, what you're talking around is some massive fundamental changes in terms of how information is managed and used in the news process. What impact do you see that having structurally in terms of news gathering organizations? In terms of news organizations?
Well, I think there's going to be several, and I think we need to take your cue from other industries that have made that transition before. I think the difficult thing about the news agents or the news business is that ultimately you're dealing with the behavior of human beings rather than simply the transit of numbers. I mean, that process went quicker ultimately through trading houses because they were looking for patterns that existed mathematically rather than patterns that were a consequence of human action. Yours is human action. But if we take that aside for a second, I think there's a couple of things that we can take away. One is, I think that technology will mean that you'll become far more dependent on outsourcing news gathering in the field to armies of stringers.
Or effectively, maybe not dependent, but able to do it.
Or able to do that. I mean, these little devices that we all became dependent on effectively replace the beta cam, have a built-in GPS, can be structured in such a way that you can put it into the hands of a stringer and have them reliably take footage in a way that you could editorially use right away. At the same time, like with most industries that have become not information dependent, you start to centralize your knowledge brokers. So in effect, those people who are best able to translate between events as they happen, report them, assemble them, will become concentrated in the organization. You'll have your super journalist, if you like, your Uber journalist that is equally familiar with the subject matter as well as being able to draw upon others to rationalize production. So I think you'll definitely see that happening to a large extent. I think the fact that you will become much more data dependent in terms of how you report is almost a foregone conclusion. The question is, whether it's going to be institutions that survive or whether it's going to be the upstarts that are able to do it. Whether you go by the way of DEC, Digital Electronic Corporation, which once was one of the powerhouses of Silicon Valley, or you become the Google. And that's a really big question mark.
It's an exciting challenge.
It's an exciting challenge, but I'd say, for the people that have long foretold the death of an institutional media, I think they're quite wrong. As Mark Twain once said, the reports of my death are very much premature. I'd say the same thing goes for big media. In some respects, this is the renaissance of big media. And the reason being is this. There's a false sense of empowerment that the internet gives, that any one of us suddenly can reach out to any quarter of the world and report on something. Oh, sure we can. But do that reliably. Do that with consistency. Do that at scale. That's only something that the institutions of big media can do. You need the editorial support. You need the infrastructural support so that basically journalists can get on and do the job that they're best able to do, which is what? Find the story.
Find the story. It's fascinating stuff. I think we're going to we'll open this up to questions. I think if people have got them or kind of observations on what you've heard so far. I think we've got a lot of journalism students in the room. Is that right? Where have we got people? There's a group that's in from one area. Where are you guys from? Indiana. Fantastic. So what question have we got from Indiana? There's one.
I was interested in what you were saying about the virtual bureau, the potential for having virtual bureaus, because you also mentioned how the importance of being able to validate sources across different social media platforms in different countries. So, I mean, how do you find that balance between having, the actual foreign correspondence and having, the potential for virtual bureaus? Where do you see the future of foreign correspondence with social media?
I think both are necessary. I mean, I don't say one replaces the other at all. In fact, one of the reasons why I was making the emphasis on subject matter expert is that there's no experience like lived experience. There's no knowledge than local knowledge. To think that you can somehow replace that by an algorithm is simply not true. In fact, the way that we're organized, we cover specific regions and countries: Venezuela, Iran, Syria, former Soviet Union. In each case, the strongest component of the team are actually the graybeards, the people that have actually spent time there, that have enough experience to say, this is bollocks and this is real, follow this, don't follow that. So you can't have that. At the same time, the fact is that if what we're going to be doing is relying on the social media space in order to be able to monitor, detect when things are happening, you actually need to have a team that's almost dedicated from a technical point of view from being able to do that. And that's what I mean by the virtual bureau. That virtual bureau doesn't have to sit in Dushanbe to be able to cover Tajikistan. They can sit in London, but they still need to be focused on understanding the local conditions and listening to them with fidelity and acuity. And those are two really interesting words that we kind of appropriated for how we look at social media. That it's not scanning social media, it's not monitoring social media. It's listening with acuity and listening with fidelity, knowing what to listen to and knowing how to listen to it in order to interpret it. That's the secret. Yeah. There's an old adage, which is probably a bad one to use, but in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. To a certain extent, the same thing is just true in cyberspace. That most organizations are kind of blind. They kind of figure that they can feel their way around, right? But it's being able to cut through it, even with one eye, that gives you the real edge.
Thank you.
Who here has actively used or is using tools like this to be able to identify stories or to spot stories? Which kind of tool? Recorded future. I'm going to describe that a bit to the rest of the group. I mean, how do you find it? What are the issues you find in using those things?
Just very briefly, it looks at various kinds of social media and looks at some trends, but as the speaker said earlier, you always need some kind of human interface or analyst in order to make sense of the data. So it's it's got its pros and cons, but it's got its limits too.
So recorded future is a bit of like a Google that you use preemptively.
Yeah.
So what you do is you essentially tell it what it is that you'd like to look for, and when it emerges, it starts to show you the pattern. Yeah. So it's a handy little tool. Probably the only...
You're essentially setting up a set of saved searches.
Correct, yeah. They're either geographic or temporal or deal with a particular subject matter, and when it starts to emerge, it's able to show you the pattern that has there. One thing I would say, though, is that there's a distinction between tools that are used for discovery and tools that are used for analysis. And the two things need to be seen separately, and they're both, again, sort of outgrowths of what the intelligence community has done. So recorded futures, interestingly enough, is one of the technologies that came on the discovery side. A technology on the sort of analysis side is something called Palantir, which if you haven't heard of is worth looking at. But this is one of the breed of what's known as intelligence fusion platforms, which means that it can take things that are dissimilar, not necessarily structured data, but structured and unstructured data, and it allows you to analyze it in terms of relationships in time, in geography, or by social relationship. And that's another aspect that's actually quite important to take into consideration.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Yes, question here.
Yeah, I have a question sort of in two areas. One is, how do you think about the fact that social media is effectively a series of commercial for-profit companies that are shaping the agenda in some ways, acting as editors, and as we learned from the European Court of Justice, obliged to redact certain stories from time to time, and also maybe challenge the notion that there is something called cyberspace, because if you look at VKontakte in Russia, it's being absorbed by sympathetic government forces or owners, and that maybe we're moving towards a federated internet, which isn't one cyberspace, but a series of cyberspaces that are carefully controlled or cordoned off. And how do you think about that? How does that change what you do, and especially on the commercial side?
Two massive points, right?
I'd say on your latter point, it actually is a huge opportunity for us, because we recognize the fact that there would be a balkanization of cyberspace that would occur both because of political currents, but also because of technological preferences, as well as just social preferences. I mean, the reason why you've seen the rise of local social media platforms isn't just because of political control, economic concerns. It's because people want to interact with something that they're familiar with linguistically. I mean, the Tajiks have this wonderful social network that's completely below the radar of anybody else.
Doesn't lend itself to 140 characters, probably, either, does it?
No, it doesn't, no. But it's wonderful because it's been constructed in order to be able to take in the fact that Tajiks are one of the largest working diasporas in the Eurasian region, right? So, yeah, I'd say that, look, from that point of view, it's very much an opportunity for us. In terms of social media platforms, becoming sort of increasingly absorbed and under rules, I mean, I think that's a natural evolution. I mean, the reality is this: there's no other domain that has been as unregulated from a public interest point of view than has cyberspace. And I think increasingly we're going to see that. In authoritarian states, it's going to take a particular bent, as you rightly said, with Kontakte. But I have a tremendous amount of faith in the resilience of people to create solutions despite those kinds of obstacles. And I go back to what I opened my remarks with in terms of Semen Yufa, the brilliant young mafiosi in Kiev that built an internet effectively that was there to join up his casinos. Eastern Ukraine, really interesting. What's the platform of choice there that's being used?
What you mean now? In terms of, I mean, I'm assuming there is some kind of battleground.
Anybody heard of Zello?
What's it called?
Zello. So Zello is a equivalent of a kind of push-to-talk radio, where basically you set up channels, you record a voice, it goes out. Brilliant. Wow. Absolutely unrecordable, which means there's no identities left behind. Interestingly enough, also not
audio
filtered.
Snapchat, right?
Oh, audio Snapchat. Okay. So that, I think, the way to look the way to look at it is that the combination of cheap, ubiquitous computing power and also access to it through mobile technologies has essentially meant that these technologies have become generative. In other words, you can create technology on the fly in order to be able to solve certain problems. And the more I look, in the sort of darker corners of the world, the more I realize that creativity, is no longer centralized just in Silicon Valley, which was the birthplace of, the sort of economically driven models that we've had of social media, but it's happening in response to local conditions, local needs, whether they're community and otherwise. So you're right. I mean, Google is what? Most people think it's a search engine. It's not. It's an advertising company.
So, kind of building on this question of them being, commercially funded organisations, what implications do you see, and also what reality do you place, or what belief do you place in some of the rumours about what Facebook and Google are planning around Facebook Zero, Google Zero? So, ubiquitous, free internet access via drones or large flying balloons across the African continent. That begins to take what is the internet and what is cyberspace to an interesting level.
Well, I think, these are ambitions that they have. These aren't necessarily realities they're going to be able to achieve.
They just bought this company, though, right? They just bought the drone company. Yeah?
I think there's going to be a lot of regulatory issues about them becoming common carriers to begin with. I mean, it's absolutely true, but, as one of my colleagues once said, a developer who works for me, if something is free, then you're the product. Yeah. And the major implication is that it's going to be a utility trade-off in terms of what you derive from them vis-a-vis what they give to you. But I wouldn't preclude in the next 10 years a reversal of a pattern that we've almost taken for granted in the last 15 years, which has been the deregulation of communications and effectively the absence of national level regulation over what is now currently cyberspace. It's interesting because previously, telecommunications.
These initiatives take it beyond national boundaries and internet because.
But ultimately, the internet is based upon a physical infrastructure of connectivity. Yeah. So when Facebook says we're going to use our own fiber optic cables in order to run our traffic so that it's not routed through telecommunications agencies that are subject to CALEA, for example, in the U.S., they're kind of wrong, because at some stage in the game, the government is going to step in and say, well, you have become the equivalent of a telecommunications carrier, therefore you should fall under a Telecommunications Act. And I think that's why I say their ambitions for becoming carriers, which have a physical embodiment, as opposed to simply a virtual overlay, are going to mean that they're actually going to become much more subject to government regulation than they have been in the past.
Fascinating. And then going up in the stratosphere a bit further, I mean, one of the most viewed videos we had on the BBC website last week was about microsatellites. I don't know if people saw this. So companies in the States now, where the technology around the physical satellites themselves is taking these devices down from something that was the size of this chair through to something this size, right? It's like a jam box, and it's they launch loads of them.
Yeah.
Really quite, they're £50,000, not £50 million. And so the technology there, in terms of surveillance technology, in terms of what's going on down the ground, another step change in terms of available data.
And I think that's, where again we start rubbing against the sort of ethical issues that are sort of unresolved. For example, if I'm a reporter with a point of view camera on a tripod on a street corner, that's seen as completely acceptable.
Yeah.
If I'm a reporter that puts the same camera on a quadcopter and puts it above a crowd, is it fundamentally different except for the point of view? Is there a different ethical standard that has to be applied to it? And I think these are one of the minefields that we haven't really quite explored fully.
I've had Rory Keflin-Jones, who's our technology correspondent, kind of have to show me really surreptitiously in Cafe Nero the video he's filmed himself of him using a drone on his golf course, saying, of course, don't show anybody, can't publish it, or else it would breach various regulations. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You've mentioned regulatory and legal aspects a number of times now, and I'm interested in the legal aspects of what you've been saying. I think I understand what a media lawyer, the traditional media lawyer looks like. I'm just wondering if you have any specialist legal lawyers in your organization, and if you do, what they look like.
I wish, to be honest, I wish I did. But the problem is not so much the legal problem in terms of how it exists. In fact, I think one of the paradoxes that it's been thrown up by the Snowden regulations or disclosures is that if you look at the letter of the law of what the NSA has done over the last 10 years, most of it finds justification within the law and the way that it's written. However, our expectations of the law have changed, and that's different. It's not a question of law interpretation. It's a question of law norms, what we expect the law to be able to uphold. And in part, it's been a problem that technology has moved far, far faster than our ability to be able to interpret it in a way that fits the reality that we're facing. And that's probably the challenge that's most evident. Now, I would like to say that that's unique and only to cyberspace, but it's not. In fact, I'd say that part of the problem with Snowden disclosure is that it's focused us almost entirely on the issue of cyberspace while avoiding actually much more ethically complex areas, such as biometric data, the collection of biometric data, how that's used, how that's stored, how that's essentially changing or forcing to rechange the social contract between citizens and states. So I think, if I was a lawyer, I'd be looking at a very prosperous proximate future because of the fact that probably we've never had a period in time in history where these questions have come to the fore in quite the same kind of way.
Cutting across so many boundaries. We've got a question at the front, and then I'll come to the gentleman at the back.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. My question is about emotion and logic in digital journalism. First case is about the Guardian. So Glenn Greenwald scooped the Snowden case, and he is a columnist and has a very strong political position. And in the American traditional reporting, he cannot write an article because there must be a clear line between news reporting and opinion. And I think it's a sign of fusion between old journalism and digital journalism. And I spent 28 years in old newspaper company, and now last 2 years I live in digital journalism and got more than 15 million page views last year. And so but I have a contradiction in my mind because I must put emotion on my column, and it is prohibited in the news reporting. But if you don't have some emotion and motivation to report news, nobody want to read news anymore, your column anymore. But at the same time, so I can put objective data on my column. And so how can I understand the fusion of emotion and logic in a new digital journalism?
Emotion versus logic. There you go.
Yeah, well,
Tackle that.
that's an interesting one. I think that Glenn Greenwald would probably argue that objectivity is a point of view, which means that to a certain extent, you're kidding yourself if you think that you can do objective journalism, that there's always some subjective interpretation to be put into it. But I think you raise a good point. I mean, one of the things about Twitter is that it's sort of like the people's tabloid, that essentially anything can go out and anything can stick, and it's very difficult to be able to discern one from the other. I'm sure that there is a temptation, and certainly there will be a temptation, to be able to create mass audience through subjective journalism, opinion-based journalism. But, I kind of take heart in the fact that when I was growing up, there was only 4 television channels, only one that carried the news. Now in North America, there's over 260. But there's still audience for all of them, and I think that diversity doesn't necessarily take away from the fact that there will be an institutional media that will stick to a much more objective form of journalism, and there will be a subjective media that does the same thing. Look at it this way. When you walk into your W.H. Smith and look at the wall of magazines, there's a huge diversity in terms of what they cover, in terms of objectivity, subjectivity, and subject matter. But you've probably become quite expert at knowing that this magazine represents this point of view, this one you can trust for factual information about financial information, and by the way, if I want to know something about sheepdog trials, this is the only place that I'll look.
There's probably not much variety in the sheepdog trial magazine space anymore, I would suspect. Gentleman at the back.
How does this virtual world of journalism function in terms of pursuing dangerous stories? Stories that in Kazakhstan or Tajikistan are not just simply telling stories that are out there, but pursuing stories that can get you killed, whether it's about corruption, trafficking, arms deals. And this club stands for supporting freelancers when they are not getting the support from their own news organizations. How will you and new digital media come to the aid of these new army of emboldened stringers when they get into trouble, and going beyond just simply crowdsourcing, but actually commissioning? What responsibility do you have to support them when it goes terribly wrong?
Right, so I'll answer your first question first. We think of, especially in the last year, as the principal threat to openness being state surveillance. I would argue that actually the much more prevalent thing that you have seen outside of North America is something called surveillance. That's not state institutions surveilling individuals, but it's the fact that you have the many and the small, armed with cell phones, armed with little bits of information, that are essentially lighting those up and making those available worldwide. In the former Soviet Union, you mentioned Kazakhstan, there's a wonderful website called kompromat.ru, where basically information about the many and the powerful is selectively made available. In other words, there is no limitation, in effect. There's a wild east in terms of who can gather information on what. If you're an investigative journalist, I think in many ways you've got a lot more leads to go on in a place like Kazakhstan because of the fact that secrets are deliberately put in the open in order to settle scores or to get one-upmanship between business people than anywhere else in the world. So to some extent, that aspect of it, I think, is much more flexible the moment that you get out into the field. In terms of answering your second question, I mean, one of the things that we've been working on internally, and for us, what we do at SecDev is as much an experiment as it is for anybody else, has been with playing with concepts like intelligence, like surveillance, and seeing how they can actually become a lot more open. So we work with a term called open intelligence. Now, the reason that we use the term intelligence is not to evoke, the sort of national security agency type bogeyman, but to recognize the fact that intelligence is about what? Information with intent, starting with a question, having a method for being able to identify and to be able to validate the sources, creating the caveats that give you the confidence in which you're able to report on them. So part of what we try to do as an organization is to make that available, yes, to, to the BBCs or the news organizations that want to adopt it internally as a methodology, but also to make it something which is accessible as a knowledge, as a process to individual stringers, to individual correspondents as well. There's nothing secret about this. It's being able to follow a process which 9 times out of 10, if you do correctly, you'll come up with the same answer.
It's not the secret, it's the danger that I'm asking
Well,
about.
look, the danger always exists. I mean, if you're a correspondent working in physical space and you decided to go 15 years ago to Bosnia, you would also be in danger. Now, there are unique dangers in cyberspace which I think are unique to cyberspace. One of them is this. The very technology that you depend on when you go into the field is also essentially a dog tag that you carry around that others can use to track your movements. It's not only, though, I would say, a danger to you as a correspondent or as a freelancer, it's also a danger to the community that you're trying to cover. And let me give you an example. Recently, the Syrian authorities have started to arrest doctors and to seize their cell phones. Why? Because doctors have on their phones a Rolodex of patients that they have treated, patients with gunshot wounds. Essentially, the hidden networks of those who could be involved in the conflict that otherwise would be invisible to the security forces. When you're a correspondent, a freelancer working in the field, and you're carrying a cell phone that has traced, ultimately, where you've made phone calls from in the last 3-4 years, has a record on it of every single phone call that you've made, phone number, may actually have information about people that you've interviewed and pictures of them, suddenly that becomes a risk to them. So I think I would flip it on its head. It's not just our responsibility to make sure that independent correspondents are prepared from a risk point of view themselves going into the field, but that they're not actually putting people that they are going to be interviewing and working in the field at risk. And to some extent, the training that we held here at the Frontline Club yesterday, a very large module of it dealt with, your responsibility as a correspondent to make sure that you knew enough about the security that was implicit to carrying these kinds of devices in field so that you didn't put the subjects of your investigations at risk.
With all this information floating around everywhere, all these data sources, are you surprised that that Malaysian plane disappeared and we saw that? No, I'm serious. It is the most, I mean, that for us, and for CNN, well documented, but for us, we had our biggest month of global reach ever by a long shot, and it was all driven by the Malaysian, the amount of human interest that was in there. Are you surprised that we haven't?
I mean, part of me is surprised, but part of me is very unsurprised because I think, again, there's a kind of almost a smug complacence that's fallen over us that we know the world now because suddenly it's visible, because of exactly the story that you were talking about before, micro satellites, the omnipresence of the NSA, etc., that everything is knowable. And we don't realize the world is actually a pretty big place. I invoke the intelligence metaphor again because it's actually a very good one to understand it. Somebody once described to me technical intelligence as this. It's like looking at the world through a straw, which means everything within that little tiny aperture that you're looking for is very, very clear, right? But everything beyond it is very, very fuzzy. And I think that, to some extent, the Malaysian airliner points to. That despite this kind of infrastructure that we have, that effectively has cast the world or the globe, in the constant gaze of one form observation or another, even something as big as a 777 flying on a pretty predictable trajectory can become lost without a trace.
That's pretty startling, isn't it? Other question. We've got another one at the back, sir.
Have we finally reached 1984?
No, and I think this is the interesting thing. I think that we've reached 1984 in the inverse. That sure, it's a lot more easy to be able to find and link information together. And I think this is the genie in the bottle that we have to deal with as free democratic societies, is to say, to what extent do we want to blind the ability to be able to link information in a way that effectively compromises that very fundamental right that we have as individuals of forgettability, of unknowability. But one of the fundamental features of 1984 was what? The memory hole. And I think that's what's changed fundamentally. Essentially what we were talking about here in terms of creating this platform that links backstories over and over time defends us against 1984, because what it means is that it's not just knowledge in real time that gets put together, but it's all knowledge that's being created in the past that gets fused together. And I think that, more than anything else, is a defense. The other thing I would say is that looking back from the perch of history over this brief 20 years that the internet has come into being, I think we'll recognize that this is essentially the greatest empowerment of humanity that we've ever seen. There are more people able to access this information, to make decisions over their individual lives than in any other place in any other time in history. I mean, I was stunned. I worked in Rwanda in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and the fact that a fisherman on the borders of the Great Lakes was able to know the price at which their fish was going to sell at in the markets of Kigali made a transformational difference in terms of the asymmetry of economies that previously existed that was entirely brokered by middlemen that were able to do that. So no, I don't think we've reached 1984. I think we've reached 2014, which is a very unique blend of, on one hand, Big Brother-like capabilities of being able to network information that does put us vulnerable in terms of making us much more knowable, but on the same time empowers us in ways that we simply never had before.
That EU ruling about Google changing someone's internet history has got some slightly alarming parallels to 1984, there, isn't it? A couple of scenes in there, weren't there, I think? Deleting. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
You've been working a lot with news organisations in the UK and US and elsewhere. How receptive have you found the organisations and journalists to these kind of new methods? Because we've heard lots of stories here about, you know, the kind of foreign correspondents that were really had to be pushed into even using Twitter and things like that. So I wonder how the two worlds fit together and whether people can master both, or whether you definitely need kind of separate parts working in separate areas.
I'd say that on the whole, journalists were the first to jump on and recognize just how important and transformative this was to their world. Because once they recognized that the technology was not a bright, shiny object that, you know, they needed to understand or be fearful of, they realized that actually all the skills that they had could be amplified and scaled through the use of these tools in a way that never before. You know, the moment that they stopped recognizing Twitter and Facebook as just a channel to write a story, but actually recognizing it as a way through which they could develop a story, their relationship changed with it entirely. For news organizations, I think it's a much more difficult challenge, in part because of the fact that they live in a competitive environment where delivery is as much a problem as gathering is, where the ethical and legal issues which may sometimes cause constraints, and when frankly sometimes just the generational issues between the digital immigrants and the digital natives means that there's a lack of a conversation that can happen between management and the journalists themselves. But on the whole, I would say that, you know, the journalism community or the news business is probably more understanding of the opportunities that exist in this area than just about any other, and probably a lot more clear about the ethical boundaries, exactly for what I said before. Because ultimately, whether you're working in the digital space or whether you're a documentary producer for Panorama, ultimately what you're trying to get is to tell a story where, yeah, maybe you will put somebody at risk at the end of the day by telling that story, but you're clear about the public interest that's being served.
So the same underlying journalistic training
absolutely.
process is central, regardless of how the technology changes.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that institutions should take heart in and be quite unabashed about.
Yeah. Where next? Because it's the thing that I mean, in terms of online news products, I mean, the first one I was involved with was back in when we rolled out Yahoo News in when it was, I guess, kind of 10 years ago, when we were rolling it out across Europe. And so the thing I've just noticed just in the last 2 or 3 years, the pace of change. I know this is a bit hackneyed, but people saying, "Oh, the pace of change is ever increasing," but it really is. I mean, in terms of the distribution technologies, the surveillance technologies, you know, Twitter's only been around. How long's Twitter been around for? 4, 5 years? Yeah. The explosion, you know, the explosion of all of these regional products. I mean, where do you see something that comes on top of all of this that changes it yet again? I mean, if you look forward 3-4 years, where do you think it's different from where it's even now?
Well, I'll give you a perverse answer, but one which is probably more accurate. So gangster in the U.S., John Derringer, when he was asked, "Why do you rob banks?" You know what he said? Because that's where the money is. Okay? Because that's where the money is. One thing you need to recognize about cyberspace is that those who inhabit it come from a very specific demographic. Okay? 2/3 of those who are online globally are under the age of 35. 50% are under the age of 25. Okay? This is the youthful
50%
demographic.
under 25.
Under 25.
Online.
Online, correct. 80% of those from users of social media, by the way. But the important thing is this, that this is the generation that has the most to lose and the most to gain by not changing the circumstances of their life. This is where the ambitions of childhood meet the structural barriers of adulthood. This is the generation of digital natives that really are going to become the consumers of the kind of product that BBC puts out.
Yeah.
What's interesting, we did a study for BBC a few years ago. We did one on Iran and then we did a slight one on China, looking at what happened when you stopped doing shortwave broadcasts to China. And the interesting thing was that the audience that you held on shortwave and the audience that you held online was completely different. So when one ended, it's not that that audience moved online, it just disappeared. Okay? So I think the first thing is to recognize is that it's the trends, it's the preferences of the demographic that's online that's going to really shape the news product that you have. And here I would bring another small data point. I'd hardly recommend that all of you read the now leaked report of the New York Times. Very, very important.
Everybody read it?
Because I think there's a number of
It's very
keen
good,
insights there that's quite good. One of which is that what was the least visited page of the New York Times digital hierarchy? Does anybody know? The front page. Okay, think about that. The masthead, the thing that once defined elite printed press, is the thing that is actually least looked upon online. Why? Because the new generation of users are navigating by interest. They're navigating by the story they follow, not by the way that it's presented. So I think, you know, if we look forward to the future, increasingly, what organizations such as the BBC are going to have to do is to really tune in to that young digital native revolution, if you like. Their preferences, understand that their metaphors have been shaped by the 260-channel TV environment, by the online gaming environment, and recognize that the presentation of the news is increasingly going to have to be navigated through that kind of initial gratification of product rather than something that the 50-year-olds can imagine that they want.
Great stuff. I think that's a good future-looking answer on which to close up. I mean, we've covered an amazing range of stuff, you know, massively changing technology, regulation, shifting in devices, all sorts of issues this throws up around privacy, around access to data. Absolutely fascinating. I hope everybody really enjoyed that and got as much as I did out of just listening to Rafal talk. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.